Forget the cinematic illusion of the wealthy, gun-slinging badass. Here is the brutal, inflation-adjusted reality. A modern fast food worker makes more in a single week than a 180s cowboy made in an entire season. We're talking about exactly $1 a day for 15 hours of bone-breaking, spine-shattering labor. That is not an exaggeration, it is a mathematical tragedy. You see, the men who actually rode the frontier were not grizzled 40-year-old outlaws with perfect aim and tailored leather jackets. They were desperate, starving teenagers. They were Civil War orphans. They were illiterate drifters running from a ruined post-war economy in the East. And their reality was a living nightmare. Imagine waking up at 3 in the morning, your clothes frozen stiff to your own skin, only to mount a half-wild horse in the pitch black. The smell of cattle dung and wet horsehair was permanently baked into their pores. They slept face down in the freezing mud, using their own boots as a pillow, just to wake up and do it all over again. But that $30 a month wasn't just low, it was a deliberate, calculated trap. The corporate ranch owners knew exactly what they were doing. They weaponized poverty. Could you survive 15 hours in the saddle, swallowing dust and dodging hooves for a single dollar? Let me know in the comments right now before we dig deeper into the nightmare. Because the physical exhaustion was only the first layer of their suffering. Your hands would bleed, your spine would compress from the constant pounding of the trot, and your eyes would burn from the unrelenting alkaline dust of the plains. They were disposable human engines powering a booming beef empire. But if the pay was a literal poverty wage, why did tens of thousands of young men rush into the frontier to claim it? The answer hides in a mathematical trap they never saw coming. Earning that miserable $30 a month was only half the battle. The real nightmare was trying to keep a single penny of it before the ranch boss clawed it back. Welcome to the Frontier Company store trap. It worked like a perfectly oiled machine designed to keep the working class entirely broke. You might think $30 went a long way back in 1875, but there is a massive catch. The ranch only provided the absolute bare minimum for survival. The chuck wagon gave you a daily ration of hardened sourdough biscuits, questionable beans, and water that often tasted like mud. Everything else? That came directly out of your own pocket. And out on the plains, inflation was completely unregulated. Need a heavy wool coat so you don't freeze to death during a freak October blizzard? That will cost you a month's wages. Need dry socks to prevent trench foot? Tobacco to keep you awake during a 24-hour shift? A decent hat to stop your face from blistering in the blinding sun? The ranch boss would gladly sell all of these to you on credit at triple the price you would pay back east. If you were handed exactly $40 after a month of eating dirt and risking your life, what's the very first luxury you're buying? Think about it, because what these guys were forced to buy will absolutely shock you. By the time payday actually rolled around, the ledger was brought out. The boss would subtract the coffee, the ammunition, the winter gear, and the replacement ropes. Suddenly, that $30 dream vanished. The cowboy wasn't building wealth, he was just treading water, desperately trying to pay off the debt he accrued simply by trying to stay alive in a hostile environment. They were essentially paying their employers for the privilege of suffering, and that was before they had to purchase the one piece of equipment that cost more than their own lives. If you think every cowboy was walking around with a dual-wielding Colt 45, think again. Most of them couldn't even afford the bullets, let alone the gun. This changes everything you thought you knew about the Wild West. We need to look at the most famous, mind-bending economic paradox of the 1870s, the concept of a $40 saddle on a $10 horse. The ranch owned the horses. The massive herds of Mustangs, known as the remuda, belonged entirely to the cattle barons. But the cowboy? The cowboy was strictly required to provide his own saddle. And that saddle was not just a piece of riding equipment, it was his entire world. It was his chair by the campfire. It was the roof over his head when he propped it up to block the freezing wind. It was his bed pillow in the dirt. A custom-tooled, heavily oiled leather rig cost upwards of $40 to $50. That was nearly 2 full months of grueling, bone-crushing labor just to buy the seat he worked in. Meanwhile, a brand new Colt Peacemaker cost around $17, and a box of cartridges was astronomically expensive. Cowboys were not bounty hunters. They were exhausted, unarmed agricultural laborers. Firing a gun for fun meant literally shooting your own dinner money into the dirt. This economic reality created a profound, almost spiritual bond between a drifter and his leather gear. A man could lose his hat, his boots, or his horse, but a cowboy would literally sell his own soul before he parted with his saddle. To lose your saddle meant you lost your identity. But outfitting a saddle was just the entry fee, because to make the only real money available on the frontier, they had to sign up for the deadliest event of the year. The Texas to Kansas long drive was the ultimate 19th century gig economy nightmare. 3 to 4 months of non-stop hell for one delayed lump sum payout. Picture 1,000 miles of absolute, unrelenting terror. This wasn't a scenic camping trip. It was a brutal march through hostile territory, pushing 3,000 massive, incredibly unpredictable longhorn cattle across flooded rivers and cracked deserts. The pacing of their lives became a chaotic blur of sleep deprivation and adrenaline. But there is a darker truth to the contract they signed. The financial mechanics of the trail were ruthlessly designed to trap them. They weren't paid a single dime while on the trail. The contract stipulated that you only got paid when and if the herd reached the railheads in Kansas. If you break your leg, no pay. If you decide you can't handle the agonizing conditions and quit, you are left afoot in the middle of the desert to die of dehydration. And the psychological pressure was unimaginable. Imagine riding perimeter guard at 2 in the morning. The sky turns pitch black. The air gets heavy. Suddenly, a lightning bolt shatters the silence. Instantly, 3,000 horned beasts weighing 1,000 pounds each explode into a blind, deafening panic. A stampede in the dark was a death sentence. If your horse stumbles, you are trampled into an unrecognizable stain in the mud before you can even scream. They survived purely on instinct, chewing on coffee grounds to stay awake, their eyes bloodshot, their bodies pushed entirely past the limits of human endurance. Every single step north was a literal gamble with the Grim Reaper. Finally, exhausted, filthy, and traumatized, the cowboy arrives in a Kansas cowtown with pockets full of cash, stepping blindly into a capitalist trap designed to ruin him. They survive 4 months of absolute life-threatening hell, only to blow a third of a year's salary in 72 feverish hours in Dodge City. Welcome to the neon mirage of the 1870s. Towns like Dodge City and Abilene were not romantic settlements. They were hyper-efficient vacuum cleaners designed to suck every last penny out of a vulnerable drifter's pocket. The moment a trail crew arrived, the trap snapped shut. Let's do the brutal math of their destruction. After 4 months of dodging death, a cowboy was handed a lump sum of roughly $120. Instantly, the prices skyrocketed. A hot bath in a tin tub, 50 cents. A professional shave to remove 4 months of matted dirt and lice, 25 cents. A glass of cheap, watered-down whiskey laced with burnt sugar and gunpowder, 25 cents a shot. Within a single night at a rigged gambling table in the local brothel, $50 would simply vanish into the smoke-filled air. But here is the psychological truth. This wasn't just financial stupidity, it was profound trauma release. These men smelled like rotting cattle. They hadn't slept on a soft surface in over 120 days. They had lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, waiting to be crushed by a stampede or drowned in a river. You've just survived 4 months of terror. You smell like cattle, and you finally have $120 to your name. Are you saving it to buy land or blowing it all in the saloon tonight? Be honest with yourself in the comments. They were desperately buying back their own humanity. They needed to feel alive again, even if it cost them everything they had suffered for. The regular hands were going broke by Tuesday, but there was one guy on the trail who wasn't worried about his bar tab because he was making a fortune. The trail boss makes bank at over $100 a month. But the real shocker? The guy boiling the beans is making more money than the guys whisking their lives dodging horns. This is the hidden corporate hierarchy of the cattle drive, and it reveals exactly what the frontier truly valued. You might assume the roughest, toughest, gun-toting bronc-buster was the highest-paid man in the camp. You would be completely wrong. Let's lay out the exact salary ladder. At the very top, the trail boss commanded a massive $100 to $120 a month. At the absolute bottom was the wrangler, usually a terrified 14-year-old in charge of the spare horses, scraping by on a pathetic $20 a month. The experienced top hands pulled in their standard $40. But right in the middle, earning a massive $60 a month, was the Coosie, the camp cook. Why? Because the cook was the undisputed psychological anchor of the entire operation. He wasn't just tossing bacon into a pan. He was the trail doctor, setting broken bones and pouring whiskey on open wounds. He was the navigator. He was the harsh mother of a dysfunctional family of armed orphans. If the cook was bad, the men got dysentery or scurvy. If the men got sick, morale collapsed. And if morale collapsed on a cattle drive, people started dying. The cattle barons understood this mathematical reality perfectly. Boiling coffee and managing a sourdough starter was valued infinitely higher than wrestling a 1,000-pound steer, because a good cook kept the labor force functioning. They paid him $60 not for his culinary skills, but for his ability to keep the crew from mentally breaking down. But what happens when the lowest paid guy on the totem pole takes a hoof to the chest? The reality of frontier medicine is worse than you think. There was no OSHA, no workers' comp, and no health insurance. If a 1,000-pound horse rolls on you and shatters your pelvis, your pay stops that exact minute. Welcome to the meat grinder of the 19th century beef industry. The pacing of your life could go from a mundane trot to absolute horror in a fraction of a second. This was the ultimate nightmare for a frontier laborer. Being hurt wasn't just a matter of enduring physical pain. It was a devastatingly slow financial death sentence. Imagine the sheer dread. Your horse steps in a prairie dog hole. You hear the sickening snap of your own femur. The moment you hit the dirt and cannot climb back into the saddle, you are no longer an asset. You are a liability. Your wages are frozen immediately. The isolation of this reality is suffocating. There are no helicopters coming to medvac you out. If you were lucky, you were thrown into the back of a wooden chuck wagon, bouncing violently over miles of uneven rocky prairie while gangrene slowly crawled up your leg. If you were unlucky, you were simply left at a random homesteader's dirt floor cabin with a bottle of whiskey and a vague promise that the boss might send for a doctor later. And the math of survival was completely rigged. Even if you magically survived the infection and made it to a town, a single visit from a legitimate doctor could completely wipe out 2 full months of your wages. An amputation would bankrupt you for life. Your physical body was your only currency, and one wrong step meant you were discarded like a broken tool. It was a meat grinder of a profession. So who exactly was desperate enough to take these terrible, life-threatening risks? History has been lying to you about their faces. It's time to shatter another massive Hollywood illusion. John Wayne wasn't the standard. Up to 1 in 4 cowboys were black, and countless others were Mexican vaqueros who taught the white hands everything they knew. This is the deliberately hidden history of the American West, scrubbed away by decades of cinematic whitewashing. The reality of the cattle trail was a rare, gritty pocket of brutal equality. When a thunderstorm rolls in at midnight and 3,000 massive longhorns decide to stampede into the darkness, the chaos does not care about the color of your skin. Yet, even in this harsh meritocracy, the corporate machine found a way to exploit its workers. We have to address the undeniable wage gap. A white cowboy riding the line might earn his standard $40 a month. Meanwhile, a black hand or a highly skilled Mexican vaquero would often be handed only $30 for doing the exact same labor. Or worse, they were assigned the most incredibly dangerous jobs on the ranch, like breaking wild, murderous Mustangs for a fraction of the pay. But out on the open plains, thousands of miles from polite society, a unique brotherhood formed in the dust. They shared the same freezing rain, drank the same bitter coffee, and faced the exact same terrifying odds of dying in a river crossing. It was a community forged entirely out of shared misery and sheer survival. They were the true architects of the cowboy culture, inventing the techniques, the terminology, and the legendary gear that defined the era. They built the foundation of the empire with their bare hands. But whether you were black, white, or Mexican, the brutal equalizer came for everyone when the leaves started to fall. The season was ending, and the real starvation was about to begin. The season ends, the adrenaline fades, and suddenly these tough, hardened horsemen are downgraded to homeless beggars drifting from ranch to ranch just to survive the winter. This was the ultimate, crushing humiliation known across the frontier as the grub line. You see, the economics of wintering were utterly brutal. The massive corporate ranches were businesses first and foremost. They absolutely could not afford to pay 20 men to sit around a stove doing nothing while the plains were buried in 3 feet of snow. So, what did they do? The moment the November frost hit, they fired 80% of their entire staff. Suddenly, the high-speed thrill of the summer vanished. It was replaced by a dark, suffocating depression. Imagine being a fiercely independent worker, a man who just spent 6 months conquering the wildest terrain on Earth. Now you have 0 income for 4 straight months. Your pockets are empty from Dodge City. You are reduced to riding your exhausted horse from one isolated ranch to another, begging for a plate of beans in a space on the floor of an uninsulated bunkhouse. The cold was relentless. The loneliness was profound. They sat in the freezing dark, mending broken leather, feeling entirely useless and quietly losing their dignity. They survived on charity and scraps, watching the wind howl outside. It was a vicious cycle of poverty. Every single year they traded their youth and their cartilage for a fleeting season of freedom, only to be cast out into the freezing wilderness the second they were no longer profitable. They were trapped in an endless loop of seasonal starvation. They thought they just had to survive the winter to ride again in the spring, but they didn't realize a permanent winter was coming to wipe their entire way of life off the map. The gig is up. The free-roaming adventurer wasn't killed by outlaws or Indians. He was murdered by a cheap piece of twisted metal and corporate syndicates. This is the tragic, melancholic end of the great American myth. It started in 1874 with the invention of barbed wire. That simple, vicious string of metal completely changed the geometry of the West. The massive, endless open plains were violently chopped up into little, manageable corporate squares. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't just metal, it was Mother Nature completely turning her back on the frontier. The catastrophic blizzards of the 1886-1887 winter, known infamously as the Big Die-Up, wiped out millions of cattle. The old system of letting herds roam free and paying wild men to chase them was instantly rendered bankrupt. The cattle syndicates realized they needed control, and with control, the cowboy was forcefully downgraded. He didn't die in a blazing shootout at high noon. He didn't ride off into a golden sunset. Instead, his magnificent, terrifying lifestyle was stripped away. The proud, free-roaming horseman was handed a pair of pliers and a post-hole digger. He faded quietly into the background, reduced to a glorified minimum-wage fence repairman and a mundane farmhand. The adrenaline was replaced with agricultural monotony. The thundering stampedes were traded for mending broken wooden posts in the mud. The corporations had won. They always do. The era bled out into history, leaving behind nothing but cheap dime novels and Hollywood lies to cover up the heartbreaking reality of an exploited workforce. We idolize the boots and the hats, but we conveniently forget the starving boys who wore them into the ground for $1 a day. The cowboy myth was just the first lie they sold us to hide the brutal economics of the past. But what they did to the men who built the railroads, that is a horror story they desperately want to keep buried.